From sacred leaf to crystal lightning, the story begins not in laboratories or city streets, but in a silence so vast it almost erases the sound of human breath. Imagine the Andes before maps and borders, before engines and wires. The mountains rise like the backs of sleeping gods, their flanks carved by thin paths and hanging valleys, their peaks dusted with a snow that never melts. The air is thin, almost translucent, as if the sky has been stretched too far. Each step taken at these altitudes pulls against the lungs. Each heartbeat works a little harder beneath bone and muscle. It is a land that does not easily concede life, and yet people have walked here for thousands of years, weaving their days between stone and cloud. On a narrow terrace carved into the mountainside, a woman bends over small glossy shrubs. Their leaves are not large or showy. They do not shout their presence like the brilliant flowers of the jungle below. They are modest, oval, a green that seems unremarkable until the light strikes them, and then they shine with a quiet intensity, as though they have swallowed a fragment of the sun. She moves slowly between them, fingers practiced, plucking each leaf with reverence, never stripping the plant bare. Beside her, a child watches, learning the gestures that have been passed down like stories, like songs. These are coca leaves, Erythroxylum coca, though that name will come much later. For now they are simply the leaf that sustain. In the thin air where breath is short and labor is heavy, the people of these slopes have made a compact with this plant. The leaves are dried, stored, carried in woven pouches at the hip, ready to be placed within the mouth at dawn and at dusk, before long journeys and long days of work. Shepherds tending their animals on distant ridges, porters winding like patient ants along perilous trails, farmers toiling in fields carved from rock, all carry the leaf as they carry water, fire, memory. Picture those travelers, moving along stone paths that cling to the sides of cliffs, the world dropping away into mist below them. Their cheeks swell slightly, not from food but from the bolus of leaves tucked carefully between gum and cheek. With each slow chew, bitterness blooms, followed by a faint numbness. A gentle warmth begins to spread through limbs exposed to cold winds. The ache of hunger recedes into the background hum of the day. Hearts still beat fast in the altitude, but the pounding no longer feels like panic. It becomes a companionable drum, measured, steady. The leaf is not a vice here, but a quiet presence, a familiar hand on the shoulder of those who must live close to the mountain's stern regard. In the worlds of the Quechua and the Aymara, coca is more than a remedy for fatigue. It is a way of speaking to forces that cannot be seen. The Andes are not empty stone in their understanding, but a living architecture shaped by beings older than any human tongue. The earth herself is Pachamama, mother of all, and each towering peak is an Apu, a mountain spirit with its own temperament, its own demands for respect. When families gather before a journey, they do not simply pack food and blanket. They select perfect leaves, unmarred and symmetrical, and offer them to the ground, pressing them into cracks in the rock, placing them beneath small piles of stones aligned with the sky. The ritual is simple but profound. Hands worn from weaving and farming hold the fragile leaves as though they were gold. Words are spoken softly, in Quechua cadences shaped by centuries. Breath touches leaf, and leaf touches earth. To chew coca is to draw on the patience of the mountains. To offer coca is to send back gratitude and petition, a thread of green binding human breath to divine attention. The leaf becomes a messenger, a carrier of thanks and requests, moving between worlds as easily as it moves between lip and gum. In the dim, smoky interiors of highland houses, coca circulates alongside stories. Elders sit cross-legged near the fire, its embers reflecting in dark eyes. They pass small cloth bags from hand to hand, inviting each person to take 3 leaves, the sacred number. The leaves are held up to the lips in a small gesture of reverence before being placed in the mouth. As time slows and conversation deepens, the bitterness on the tongue seems to sharpen memory itself. Tales of ancestors, of old journeys, of battles and floods and famines, are told and retold, each generation adding and refining, like the slow work of polishing stone. When someone dies, coca does not abandon them. At burial, carefully chosen leaves are placed with the body, tucked into cloth wrappings, pressed into the soil near the head and hand. The journey beyond the horizon is imagined as long, perhaps as arduous as any crossing of high passes and frozen rivers. The dead, too, will need a companion to soften hunger and lend endurance. In this way, coca crosses the boundary between the living and the dead, its utility extending beyond the known world into the territory of speculation and faith. Yet even as coca is braided into ceremony and survival, it remains at heart a plant of the everyday. It is taken at dawn before the first blow of the hoe meets earth. It is shared between strangers as a sign of trust, a non-verbal declaration that one comes in peace. It marks pauses in labor, punctuates negotiations, and fills the minor gaps of the day with a kind of low, steady light in the mind. The alertness it brings is not the sharp, tremulous wakefulness that will later be associated with its purified form, but something humbler, a lifting of weariness, a softening of the edges of pain, the ability to sing a little longer into the night. Then come sails on the western horizon, and with them, a fracture that will send tremors through every aspect of life in these mountains. The Spanish arrive with steel and scripture, their armor shining in the thin air, their horses stamping nervously on unfamiliar ground. At first they see coca only in passing, small green leaves exchanged between dark-skinned porters, fields of low shrubs tended with care. Missionaries, uneasy with any practice not sanctioned by their faith, write anxious reports about idolatrous rituals in which leaves are offered to earth and stone. For them, the leaf is suspicious, a possible agent of the old gods they wish to erase. Yet practicality soon softens condemnation. The colonizers, intent on extracting silver from the bowels of the Andes, require labor on a scale that the local environment makes dangerous. In the depths of mines, where air is stale and daylight never enters, men work beyond the limits of normal endurance. They walk miles to reach the shafts, climb back exhausted and underfed, then are expected to return again and again. The Spanish notice that those who chew coca can work longer, complain less of hunger, and bear the relentless demands of forced labor with a little more strength. Accounts from the period describe attempts to ban coca, followed by reversals when production in the mines suffered. Church authorities denounce its use in rituals while mine owners encourage its distribution to workers. Thus the leaf's ancient role as companion to toil and prayer is twisted into a tool of an empire's appetite. Fields of coca are expanded not only for indigenous communities, but for sale and taxation, woven into the machinery of colonial economics. Still, in the high villages away from the mining towns, coca continues to live its older life. There, beneath a night sky studded with stars that seem close enough to touch, the leaf is not merely tolerated, but cherished. Songs address it by intimate names. Farmers ask it for luck in harvests. Young people invoke it in matters of the heart. The duality deepens. Coca becomes both a solace against colonial oppression and an instrument by which that oppression is maintained. Medicine and poison, salvation and instrument of exploitation, begin to share the same green surface. Centuries pass, ships cross and recross the Atlantic, bearing silver, textiles, letters, and occasionally small shipments of coca leaves destined for the cabinets of European collectors and the curiosity of physicians. Yet the leaf does not travel well in its raw state. Its bitter virtues fade over the long journey. The climate of distant ports does not suit its preservation. For a long time, coca remains more rumor than reality in European minds, a strange habit of distant peoples, noted in travelers' accounts, but not yet central to the story of Western medicine. It is in the 19th century, the age of gaslight and steam, that the story changes. Europe and North America enter a period of fervent scientific curiosity. Laboratories proliferate, modest rooms filled with glassware, retorts, balances, and the new language of chemistry. The air in these spaces is thick with the scents of solvents and heated metal. White-coated figures move between benches, recording observations in careful script, their minds fixed on the possibility that within each plant lies a hidden essence, a key that might unlock new powers over the body and mind. Alkaloid chemistry becomes a discipline unto itself. From the bark of the cinchona tree, quinine has been extracted, a bitter compound that can push back the fevers of malaria. From opium poppies, morphine has been drawn forth, a crystalline substance that relieves pain so effectively it seems almost miraculous. Each success strengthens the conviction that every medicinal plant holds within it a similar secret, an active principle that can be disentangled from its fibrous prison, purified, weighed, measured, and deployed with precision. Somewhere in this world of meticulous experimentation, dried coca leaves arrive on a laboratory table. They are ground, soaked, filtered, treated with reagents whose names echo softly in the mind. Acids, bases, alcohol. Glass flasks catch the pale light as liquids are poured from one vessel to another, cloudy mixtures becoming clearer with each step. The process is more art than recipe at this early stage, guided by intuition, experience, and the half-remembered reports of others. In time, a new substance appears, a fine powder or small transparent crystals, shimmering under the laboratory lamps. They are colorless, as though the green of the leaf has been stripped away, leaving only a faint, glinting residue. This is cocaine, the purified alkaloid, isolated and named. To those who first hold it in their hands, it must have seemed as though they had trapped a fragment of the leaf spirit in solid form. The first experiments with cocaine's effects are cautious, almost tentative. The powder is applied to the tongue, and a curious numbness spreads. The bitterness is there, but behind it lies a new sensation, a local anesthesia that quiets sensation wherever it touches. Physicians of the time understand pain as both an enemy and a guide. They are eager for any substance that might quiet its cries without plunging the entire body into dangerous oblivion. Ophthalmology, the delicate art of operating on the eye, becomes one of the first fields to embrace this new compound. Picture a small surgical theatre in the late 19th century. Windows admit the pale, filtered light of a cloudy day. A patient sits upright in a chair, chest tight with anxiety, knowing that any movement could mean the difference between sight and darkness. The surgeon, hands steady but heart aware of the risks, applies solutions of cocaine to the surface of the eye. Gradually, the sensation fades. The patient's lids no longer flutter at the touch of the instrument. A thin line of incision is made, nearly bloodless, and for the first time such procedures can be done without excruciating agony. Cocaine, in these early moments, is almost pure salvation. Beyond surgery, physicians begin to notice another property. When taken by mouth or injected, cocaine does more than numb, it awakens. Fatigue lifts, as if a veil has been drawn aside. The mind seems sharper, more capable, worries recede. For scholars, doctors and writers, often working long hours in gaslit rooms, the allure is obvious. Among them is a young neurologist in Vienna, fascinated by the workings of the human mind, and by substances that might influence it. He reads glowing reports about coca and its derivatives, experiments on himself and his friends, and writes essays praising its capacity to banish tiredness and melancholy. His words are carried across Europe by journals and lectures. Cocaine, once obscure, begins to acquire a reputation as a wonder drug, a filtrate of the Andes that promises both relief from pain and enhancement of energy. Pharmacists prepare tinctures and tablets. Doctors prescribe it for migraines, digestive troubles, and what is then called neurasthenia, a diffuse exhaustion of nerves thought to be the cost of modern life. In clinics and private homes, patients take it with gratitude, unaware that this crystalline benefactor carries shadows that have not yet been seen. From there, cocaine steps beyond the confines of the clinic. The 19th century is an age not only of science but of commerce. Entrepreneurs recognize that what heals the sick might also be sold to the well. Wines and tonics enriched with coca extracts begin to appear, their labels adorned with elegant scripts and intricate design. Bottles containing deep red liquids, scented with herbs and fortified with wine, promise to restore vigor to the weary, to grant courage to the timid, to brighten the spirits of those dulled by long winters and longer workdays. Imagine the counters of an apothecary shop in Paris or New York around the turning of the century. Glass bottles, some filled with opalescent syrups, others with powders and tablets, line the shelves. Among them a bottle of dark liquid carries the stylized image of a leaf and grape. The advertising for such products speaks of stamina, creativity, clear thinking. In drawing rooms and cafes, people lift small glasses of coca-infused wine to their lips, toasting to health, to industry, to modernity itself. As these preparations spread, the distinction between medicine and indulgence, between treatment and recreation, becomes increasingly blurred. Cocaine is present in lozenges sold for sore throats, in drops for toothache, in tonics marketed to tired housewives and overworked clerks. It appears in small quantities in early formulations of popular soft drinks, their carbonation and sweetness masking the bitter note of the leaf. The mountain's whisper, once carried in modest boluses between cheek and gum, has become a subtle undercurrent in the beverages and remedies of rising industrial societies. By the early years of the 20th century, cocaine has stepped decisively into the city night. Picture crowded boulevards under gaslight, or nascent electric bulbs that hum faintly overhead. Carriages clatter past as men in dark suits and women in feathered hats move between theatres, clubs, and smoky backrooms. In some of these rooms, mirrors lie flat on wooden tables, gleaming coldly under the lamp. Upon them, fine white lines are arranged with care, like rails laid across a bright but treacherous landscape. Businessmen who have spent their days in counting houses and boardrooms now seek an edge that will allow them to continue to negotiate late into the night, or simply to drink without succumbing to drowsiness. Artists and writers, caught in the tension between inspiration and deadline, dab at small vials, trusting that the sharp, clean surge in their veins will loosen the imagination's gates. Laborers, paid little and worked hard, find in the powder a brief escape from their aching backs and the monotony of their days. Advertisements continue to speak in ornate, confident tones. Posters promise renewed vigor, increased productivity, release from sadness. Illustrated newspapers carry tasteful images of respectable people, partaking in invigorating remedies, their smiles broad, their postures upright. Behind the print, however, the substance is beginning to reveal another side. Physicians, increasingly attentive to patterns in their patients, start to notice a strange restlessness, a decline that follows the initial euphoria. Hearts pound erratically, sleep becomes elusive, hands tremble slightly in the consulting rooms, and when prescriptions run out, some patients grow desperate. Reports trickle in of individuals who seem ensnared. They return again and again for refills, their reasons shifting, their narratives frayed. When denied, they seek other routes. The assistance of less scrupulous pharmacists, the black market emerging at the edges of the law. In the operating theatres where cocaine once seemed an unambiguous gift, surgeons observe colleagues who have begun to use the drug not only on their patients but on themselves, seeking clarity and steadiness, only to find in time that their hands no longer obey as they once did. Public discourse, slow to shift, begins to change its tone. Newspapers, always hungry for sensation, print lurid stories that fuse moral panic with the racial anxieties of the age. In some accounts, cocaine is portrayed as a contagion spreading from marginalized communities into the hearts of respectable society, a narrative that serves existing prejudices more than it reflects reality. The same substance that in elite circles has been celebrated as a mark of sophistication becomes in such stories a symptom of degeneracy when found among the poor, the foreign, the already feared. Governments respond not as healers but as regulators, and increasingly as enforcers. International conferences are convened to discuss the control of opium and coca derivatives. Treaties are drafted, then signed by distant hands, declaring certain uses of these substances legitimate and others criminal. In pharmacies, cocaine moves from openly displayed bottles behind the counter into locked cabinets, then disappears altogether from many legitimate shelves. Laws are written in dense official language, but their effects are felt concretely in the daily lives of those who use, sell, and depend upon the drug. Pushed from licensed counters and prescription pads, cocaine does not vanish. It simply learns to travel differently. What was once measured by apothecaries and dispensed in embossed bottles now moves through more secret channels, in the lining of trunks, in the false bottoms of crates, in the hidden compartments of ships. Ports and railheads become quiet battlegrounds between inspectors and smugglers, each adapting to the other's techniques. A new economy of risk and reward begins to form along the world's trade routes. Meanwhile, back in the Andes, farmers still tend coca shrubs on terraced hillsides. For them, the leaf has never lost its older meanings. It remains a sacrament at festivals, a medicine for altitude and fatigue, a form of currency in small transactions, but external pressures increase. As international attention turns to cocaine, it settles uneasily on coca itself, blurring the distinction between plant and product. Indigenous communities find themselves defending their ancient practices in forums far removed from their own traditions, explaining, again and again, that the leaf in their mouths is not the white powder on foreign mirrors. As the 20th century advances, global demand for cocaine grows despite, or perhaps partly because of its new status as contraband. In cities where nightlife intensifies and workdays lengthen, the promise of wakefulness and heightened emotion continues to exert its pull. Traffickers, sensing opportunity, organize themselves with increasing sophistication. The geography of production shifts, and in remote valleys and forest clearings, clandestine laboratories appear, little more than shacks or makeshift tents at first, then more permanent structures, shielded by foliage and distance. The work done in these hidden places is a darker echo of the laboratory experiments of the previous century. Leaves are gathered in bulk now, measured not in handfuls, but in bays. They arrive on the backs of mules, in the beds of rusted trucks, stacked in rooms that smell of chlorophyll and damp cloth. Workers trample them underfoot or submerge them in vats, coaxing from them a thick, pungent paste. Solvents are poured, stirred, pressed, poured again. The resulting substance, still far from the crystalline purity sold in distant markets, is nonetheless potent enough to be traded on, refined further along the line, transformed step by step into a commodity that commands extraordinary prices. In this process, the mountain's whisper has become a supply chain. Each phase of the journey from leaf to paste, from paste to powder, involves hands and lives, each with their own reasons for being there. Some are driven by poverty, some by greed, some by entire communities become entwined with the trade, not from any love of the distant consumers, but from an absence of viable alternative. Where governments have neglected roads, schools and markets, the commerce in coca and its derivatives offers, for a time, a more reliable income than coffee or corn. Cartels emerge from this environment, not as mythic entities but as the cumulative result of many small decisions, many quiet compromises. They arm themselves vigorously, anticipating conflict with rivals, and with the state. In certain regions they begin to resemble shadow governments, collecting their own taxes, imposing their own laws. Airstrips are cut into the forest, narrow clearings that gleam under the moon. Small planes, painted in unremarkable colors, lift off with cargoes whose value far exceeds their weight, banking over jungles that have become both refuge and prison. Far away, in the neighborhoods where these shipments ultimately arrive, a different landscape forms. There, in the decaying cores of cities, neglected by post-war prosperity, the powder that began as mountain leaves and forest paste undergoes one more transformation. It is heated, mixed, altered in kitchens and back rooms. The result is a form that can be smoked rather than snorted, its effects compressed into even shorter, more intense bursts. Small rocks, pale and irregular, pass from hand to hand, their cheapness making them accessible to those who could never have bought an elegant vial in a nightclub. The smoke from these fragments does not drift lazily upward like incense. It bursts into the lungs and then into the brain like fire. For minutes, perhaps less, the world narrows to a point of fierce clarity, then collapses into a trough of craving. The cycle repeats with terrible speed, eating into sleep, appetite, judgment, and finally into the structures of everyday life. Families strain under the weight of disappearances and returns. Children learn to read the signs of use in the faces of their elders. In alleyways and tenements, the once abstract war on drugs manifests as police raids, sirens, and the quiet grief of those who watch loved ones fade into preoccupation with that next small stone, that next exhalation of harsh, chemical-laced smoke. Governments respond again, and this time the language they choose is overtly martial. It is a war, they say, against substances, against dealers, against users, against the erosion of social order. Laws are tightened, sentences lengthened. In some countries, entire neighborhoods are subject to intense policing. Possession of even small amounts becomes a pathway into prison. Mandatory sentences fill cells faster than they can be built. The burden of this enforcement falls unevenly, resting heaviest on the poor, on communities already weighed down by economic abandonment and unresolved historical wounds. In producing regions, the war manifests differently. There, soldiers and guerrilla fighters move along the same riverbanks where generations earlier, children played and women washed clothes. Spraying planes release clouds of chemicals over fields in attempts to eradicate coca, blackening not only the shrubs intended for illicit use, but also food crops for local families. Villagers wake to find their maize withered, their yucca yellowed, their soil contaminated. The choice they face becomes sharper, more cruel: to accept the risks of involvement in the coca economy, or to endure hunger in the name of laws written far away. The conflict weaves itself into the very fabric of these landscapes. Rivers carry away not only soil and debris, but also stories whispered in the night of sons recruited into armed groups, of daughters who leave for the city and do not return, of elders who shake their heads and say that they have never seen days as troubled as these. Yet even in the midst of this turbulence, coca leaves are still offered to Pachamama in quiet ceremonies, still chewed by farmers as they hoe the ground. The leaf's sacred face persists alongside its criminalized shadow. As the 20th century turns into the 21st, the trade in cocaine wraps itself more tightly around the globe, like a restless satellite circling the planet along invisible trajectories. If one could make visible all the routes by which it travels, from remote airstrips to coastal ports, from hidden compartments in ships to containers on trains and trucks, the earth would seem bound a web of ghostly lines. Each line represents not only the movement of a substance but also of hope, fear, necessity and desire. Picture a banker in a high-rise office, overlooking a glittering cityscape, its towers lit like beacons in the night. After long days of negotiation and analysis, he reaches for a small packet, seeking a dose of focus and confidence that for a time seems to sharpen his thoughts and loosen his tongue. In another part of the same city, a nurse finishes a grueling shift at a hospital, where suffering has 1,000 faces. Exhausted beyond words, she accepts from a friend the same white powder, told that it will help her feel awake, perhaps even joyful, just for an evening. In a different country, a teenager, restless and curious, watches older peers and wonders what it would be like to feel everything more intensely, or perhaps to feel nothing at all. A courier, pressed by debts or threats, swallows small packets wrapped in plastic, boarding a plane with a mixture of dread and determination. At the other end of the route, the same molecule that once sat quietly in the veins of an Andean leaf now traverses human bodies and systems of law, migrating through veins and circuits, through synapses and spreadsheets. Behind these individual stories, cocaine has become braided into global finance in more complex ways. Money earned from its sale moves through channels designed to sanitize and invisibly integrate it into legitimate economies. It passes through shell companies, property deals and offshore accounts, eventually emerging as capital that builds apartment towers or funds ventures whose origins no one publicly questions. Thus the leaf that once sustained shepherds on thin mountain paths now also sustains invisible mechanisms of profit in climates and cultures far removed from its native soil. At the same time, cracks appear in the previously solid edifice of prohibition. Some countries, having witnessed decades of punitive policies without a corresponding decrease in harm, begin to question whether war is the only or even the best metaphor available. In quiet, careful tones, health workers, social scientists and community leaders speak of harm reduction, of shifting the focus from chasing and punishing to understanding and mitigating. Supervised consumption rooms are opened in certain cities, plain spaces where those who use drugs can do so under medical observation, shielded for a time from the twin dangers of overdose and contamination. Elsewhere, substitution therapies are extended, not for cocaine itself, which resists such approaches, but for other substances whose use often intersects with its own. Needle exchange programs distribute clean equipment, not as an endorsement of use, but as a recognition of the human being behind each act, a refusal to let disease add another layer of suffering. Decriminalization experiments are undertaken, treating possession of small amounts less as a crime and more as an indicator of vulnerability, of unmet needs. In these places, the language shifts perceptibly. Those once labeled addicts begin, in some contexts, to be described as people who use drugs, a subtle change that recenters their humanity. Policymakers tentatively acknowledge that trauma, inequality, and social disconnection all play roles in why some individuals seek out substances that alter consciousness. Neurosciences contribute images and explanations, showing how cocaine floods certain brain pathways with signaling chemicals, reinforcing behaviors in ways that are not easily reversed by willpower alone. Yet even as these more compassionate approaches take root in some regions, the broader trade endures. Fields are still planted, laboratories still operate under canopy and cloud. Interdiction efforts shift routes but rarely erase demand, shaped by the ceaseless pressures and empty spaces of modern life, persists. For some, cocaine is a means to work longer, to meet expectations that feel unrelenting. For others, it is a brief escape from conditions that otherwise offer little joy or agency. For still others, it is a way to feel something in a world that for various reasons has gone numb. The duality that has accompanied coca from its earliest days remains. It is both medicine and menace, ally and adversary, sacred leaf and crystal light. In the Andean highlands, an elder may still sit on a low stool before a rough-hewn altar, holding 3 perfect leaves between weathered fingers, whispering thanks to Pachamama for another day of life, another season of harvest. In a downtown apartment, a mirror may still gleam under artificial light, bearing thin white lines that promise, falsely, to banish doubt and fatigue. Between these images lies a question that law, science, and commerce have not fully answered. What is it, exactly, that we are seeking when we turn to substances like cocaine? Is it the ability to outrun our own limits? To silence, even briefly, the protests of tired bodies and anxious minds? Is it a hunger for intensity in an increasingly mediated world, or a desire to dull the sharp edges of circumstances that feel unbearable? Perhaps, in some sense, the question is as old as humanity itself. From the first time someone discovered that a particular leaf could ease hunger on a mountain path, or that a fermented drink could blur the edges of sorrow, there has been this ongoing negotiation between our inner states and the materials we find around us. Coca, in its journey from green shrub to white crystal, from sacred offering to contraband commodity, has simply traced one of the most dramatic arcs in that long entwined history. Tonight, as you picture flight paths and shipping lanes glowing like ghostly veins across a dim glow, as you imagine terraces carved into stony slopes and city streets slick with rain, you may sense how intimately this story is connected to all the others. Stories of empires and resistance, of poverty and innovation, of the ways in which human beings everywhere seek to endure themselves and their world. In the soft pause between heartbeats when neither craving nor judgment speaks loudly, another question lingers like a breath in cold air. Not only what we are trying to numb, or amplify, or escape, but what kind of society might emerge if, instead of waging wars on leaves and powders, we learn to listen more deeply to the reasons we reach for them at all.